They were led into the dining hall expecting punishment. But instead of guards shouting orders, they heard music. Instead of rations, they smelled roast turkey. Then the American officer smiled and said words that no prisoner of war could ever forget. "It's Christmas. You're our guests today." The German women froze. Guests in an American prison camp? For a moment they thought it was a cruel joke, because just weeks earlier, these same women had been herded like animals across Europe, starving, terrified, and stripped of dignity. They'd heard stories that the Americans were monsters, yet here they were and being served chocolate cake and coffee. By their captors, one of them whispered, trembling, "Why are they doing this? We killed their sons." What happened that day would leave hardened soldiers and frightened prisoners in tears. It would become one of the most haunting, unbelievable Christmas stories of World War II. It was winter of 1944. The war had become a long, harsh algebra of loss. Whole neighborhoods were numbers on a list. Families were names sometimes scrawled on a scrap of paper, sometimes never written at all. Across the ocean, the United States held hundreds of prisoners taken in campaigns across Europe and North Africa. They were men who drank water from wells now dry in their memory, men who had been a butcher, a baker, a teacher. They were captured and transported to camps in places with names they could not pronounce. Plains of Montana, high deserts, river valleys, and far from anything that smelled like home. Fort Missoula, or a similar timber camp in that long winter, sheltered scores of German prisoners. Wood barracks lined up like a lost regiment. The work was grueling: haul logs, split firewood, clear roads. The men had rations, but rations are arithmetic, not warmth. Letters came sporadically or not at all. News from home came in rumor and fear. They learned to stop expecting the familiar rhythms of life: births, birthdays, church bells. The whistle called them, the roll was taken, and life narrowed to chores and cold. The American soldiers who guarded them were often young too. They had left kitchens and streets back home and found themselves assigned to watch men who might, a year earlier, have been boys on the same block. Among those guards was Sergeant James Holloway, who had a thin, tired smile and a habit of walking the mess hall at dawn. He had seen enough war to know one thing: the human heart does not break only on the battlefield. It breaks quietly, day after day. It was this knowledge that made him, on a bitter morning when the bone-cold wind spoke of hunger in far places, ask a simple question of his commander: what if, just for today, we treat them like guests? Heinz Reinhardt woke before the light. He curled his hands inside rough wool mittens, trying to rub warmth back into fingers that had long ago stopped remembering tenderness. He had been a machinist in Hamburg once. Now he moved through a routine of roll calls and labor, counting days like chips in a game he never wanted to play. He and the other men shuffled through the barracks, shoulders hunched, faces carved by cold and absence. A low murmur ran through them. Some sleep, some whisper, some simply stared. "We will line up, count off, work the whole day," someone said, voice flat. That was the expectation, the default. That was how the camp ate time, one command after another. Even the idea of Christmas felt like a trick played on a child. It was a word from a world that had nothing to do with barbed wire. The guards' boots crunched on the frozen yard. The usual whistle of roll call made its thin song. Then the voice said something different. The men paused. "No work today. It's Christmas," the guard said. A ripple of confusion passed across faces. Some laughed, brittle and disbelieving. They taught each other distrust as easily as orders had taught them to march. The translator, a young man who still thought of Leipzig as home, repeated the phrase in German, and it sat in the air like a foreign coin. Heinz felt a small, flaring pulse of hope and then, as if struck, the immediate reflex to protect himself. You do not let yourself want in a place where wanting can be used against you. And so they waited, like men at the edge of an ocean that might swallow them or might suddenly retreat. The yard smelled of damp wool and coal smoke. The windows were frosted white. Across the compound, a thin column of steam drifted from the mess hall. If the truth be told, they listened first with doubt, then with curiosity, then with a dangerous, childish hunger for what the word guest might mean. There were hushed jokes, sarcastic and quick. Maybe the Americans would hand out cigars, maybe sugar, maybe a trick. Corporal Dieter, older by a decade and worn like a tool, said nothing. He moved as if the day were ordinary, but the younger ones, The ones who remembered fields and orchards more than battle plans tightened at the door. When the smell moved in like warm lighting across faces, mouths parted, the central truth revealed itself not in speech, but in the way the men's bodies inclined toward heat, like plants finding the light. They walked toward the mess hall in a slow, doubtful procession. Snow lifted and fell around them in small, patient flakes that seemed indifferent to the extraordinary human drama they were stepping into. At the doorway, the temperature changed like a scene cut in a film. The world beyond the threshold was brighter, softer. Inside, the long tables were covered in white linen. Not the practical oilcloth of working life, but cloth starched into a rectangle of ceremony. A little pine sprig lay at each place, tied with a scrap of red string. Paper garlands looped between bare rafters. Someone had strung a handful of lights, and the bulbs made the steam from kettles glow like lanterns. Heinz stepped through and found himself breathing more easily. There was a smell that the heart remembers more surely than the mind. Roast meat and butter, the golden tang of something made with love rather than necessity. Mashed potatoes steamed in a basin, gravy pooled in a ladle. Vegetables gleamed with a gloss of glaze. The pies, blown in their crusts with artistry, emitted a cinnamon perfume the likes of which few of them had dared to imagine in years. Cereals and ration bread had been their math. This was geometry, shape, color, and abundance. At the serving line, Sergeant Holloway stood in a plain apron, palms dusted with flour. He scooped and served with the steady hand of a man who had cooked for a unit and understood how breaking bread could change an atmosphere. Beside him, an older cook, flour on his sleeves and a kindly fatigue in his face, moved with practiced economy, making sure each plate held more than needed. The men hesitated, then a translator, voice trembling, told them in German to take what they wanted. It was the kind of permission that is dangerous in a prison, and therefore felt like grace. Heinz saw a plate laid before him, real ceramic, white, smooth. The feel of it was odd and sharp. On it lay a thick slice of turkey, steam braided across the meat, its skin golden and yielding. The first bite of turkey was an astonishment, fat and salt and texture that slid between his teeth and into some place where hunger and memory met. He swallowed it, and the sensation made him aware of all the other little losses. The milk that tasted like water in camps across Europe. The bread that used to be warm in his mother's hands. Here the milk was whole and white and cold enough to beat on the glass. The potatoes carried butter in pools that caught the light. The cranberry sauce glinted like a small red jewel on the side of the plate. Each item was a punctuation in the sentence of a life he'd thought ended. Around him, men moved through the line in stunned quiet. Some ate quickly, as if to prove the feast real. Others touched the food and then put their hands away as if afraid to break a spell. One private, a freckled American boy who must have been 18, poured a long glass of milk for a man and set it before him without a word. The German took it with both hands, cradling it like a relic. The kitchen staff kept serving, and the plates grew fuller. Pies were sliced and set down, and when that first fork bit through flaky crust into warm apple filling, the room inhaled as one. A record player in the corner creaked and warmed, and a big band tune filtered through the air, something jaunty, something that would have been a dance tune in another life. The music underscored the surreal, the orchestra of ordinary life playing in the middle of confinement. Men looked at each other with wet eyes they would not explain. The Americans ate too, but their movements were softer, less businesslike, as if the act of offering had softened them as well. Heinz found himself remembering small things. His mother rolling dough and speaking in a voice that smelled of yeast and old newspapers. His sweetheart's laugh at a summer fair. The taste of butter brought them back in a vivid, painful flash. Tears would come, he thought. Tears were possible again. He was both ashamed and relieved by the thought. Then came the moment of the pies. The cook came out with a cart. 3 pies balanced high, their juices and spices exhaling into the air as if to prove their existence. One by one they were cut and placed in front of each man. The first bite of apple pie, warm, spiced, tender, brought a tremor through the room. Someone swallowed hard, then began to weep quietly. It was contagious. A man at the next table pushed his fork into the pastry and set it down untouched when the sobs began. Another man, older and reserved, struck his hand against the table as if anchoring himself to the moment. No one had told them to cry. They simply realized they could. In a place where vulnerability was once a liability, this small permission, given by hot food and kind eyes, became revolutionary. The record kept turning, the music kept playing, and for a fragile stretch of time, the soft sounds of eating and weeping braided together into a human chorus. When the plates were swept away, Holloway and his men brought a basket of bright, absurd oranges. They set them down as if they were treasures. Heinz stared at the fruit, then pressed his thumb to its skin. The citrus burst with perfume, a smell like sun and summer orchards he had not seen in years. He held the orange to his chest like a small living thing. The private said simply, "Merry Christmas," and the translator repeated the words, each syllable trembling, as if it might be snatched away. They left the hall slower than they had come, each man carrying a small warmth, not just from food but from being seen, being treated as a person, rather than a number. The snow in the yard glittered like something that could be consolatory. The guards had done something simple and enormous. They had offered an ordinary human kindness in an extraordinary place. The shock lay in the smallness of the act, and in how unprepared they were to receive it. The crying subsided into quiet conversation. The men sat in the barracks later that afternoon, orange peels curled like faint spirals on the windowsills. Some stacked their plates neatly, some chewed slowly, still tasting the memory. A few could not sleep. The warmth of the day had switched something on inside them that the hard daily grind could not smother. Heinz found a corner of the barracks and listened to soft voices. Someone hummed a hymn, not out of religion but out of habit, and others chimed in because the sound of human voices together felt like a stitch in a torn fabric. The translator read aloud in an awkward voice a line from a letter he once had, about snow, about bread, about the small, unimaginable things that made life gentle. The voice cracked, and someone else took up the reading with steadier cadence. Conversations began to wander into territories avoided before. Do you remember the last winter at home? Do you remember the bakery on Georgstrasse? They spoke of women and children and of jobs that seemed now like the lives of strangers. They laughed sometimes at the little ridiculousness of memory, a lamp that had always burned in the corner, a dog that had once stolen their shoe. The laughter was shy, like a bird stepping back toward the window. Outside, the guards went about their duties with a new, quiet respect. Sergeant Holloway walked the perimeter that afternoon, but his gait had altered. He carried the look of a man who had given something away and felt better for it. Young privates exchanged glances with the prisoners and, for the first time, saw not enemies but exhausted human beings caught in the same storm. They fed them that morning, but they also fed themselves in some emotional currency. The satisfaction of acting decently in an indecent world. Over the days and weeks that followed, small things changed. The prisoners who worked in the kitchen were given extra portions now and then. Some of the guards allowed small favors. An extra blanket, extra coal for the stove, longer time by the mess hall stove. Not all acts were grand. Most were tiny, pragmatic, daily. A private might help repair a man's worn boot in the evenings. A cook might save a sugar ration for someone's tea. It was not that the war had softened overnight. The machine of war continued. But these gestures built a bridge, less of politics, more of person-to-person repair. Friendships, if such a word could be used, began in awkward ways. A prisoner who could fix a radio cabinet traded that skill for warm socks. A guard who had grown up on a farm and knew how to mend a harness taught a prisoner how to carve a wooden spoon without splitting it. They traded tools and stories and small confidences. It did not erase the barbed wire, nor the reality of being on opposite sides, but it humanized a landscape often rendered as cardboard cutouts in the large history books. Heinz met an older corporal, a quiet man named Friedrich, whose hands had been cut and weathered in factory work. Friedrich spoke of a son he hadn't seen since the front and of the unbearable waiting. He spoke with an honesty that made others lean in. Heinz, in turn, told stories of a girlfriend who would wait, maybe, or maybe she had married another by now. The stories that are half wish and half grief. In this exchange, men found a way to be more honest with themselves. A notable moment came when a guard, a young corporal with a first name too familiar, like Tom or Bill, sat down without formality at the prisoner's table one afternoon with a mug of coffee. The gesture contained no surrender. Never that. It was simply a man reaching across to the humanity opposite him. Some prisoners recoiled, others accepted. Small talk began. Weather, hunger, the absurdity of bureaucracy. The guard told of his family, how they had chopped their Christmas tree together back home, how the youngest wanted to hang a star. A prisoner described the town square where, in memory, snow lay like sugar over the roofs. They exchanged images like gifts. These exchanges were fragile and sometimes dangerous. There were whispers among some soldiers that such closeness could undermine discipline. There were also murmurs among prisoners that friendship could be a trap, a way to be softened for usefulness. But the day-to-day reality, cold winter nights, shared work and shared food, pushed them toward each other in ways policy seldom intended. By the time the first thaw came, the lines on the ground had softened. Men who had once regarded each other with suspicion now offered a nod or a curt hello. The story of the Christmas meal spread beyond the camp, too. Letters and reports, retold in different versions, reached families on both sides. People who had been convinced of the enemy's absolute inhumanity found themselves confronted with images of boys and men eating pie and holding on to oranges like relics of a vanished childhood. For some on the home front, the news was baffling. For others, it was a seed of hope that perhaps the war's end could also be a beginning. What does this small day mean in the enormous ledger of history? How do you weigh a turkey against the loss of cities? How do you balance pie with the grim arithmetic of casualty lists? These questions are not trivial. Yet the story of that Christmas, and simple and luminous, tells us something the maps and treaties often conceal: that the human heart keeps accounting even when the world goes bankrupt. For many who sat in that warm hall, the memory became an anchor. Heinz returned home to ruins. Hamburg's streets were skeletons of what they had been, yet he carried the memory of hot pie, of clean linen, of milk that came with the ease of abundance. The image of the sergeant with flour on his sleeves, smiling in a way that had nothing to do with propaganda, stayed with him. In later years, when letters reached him from old comrades who had found bitterness or forgiveness, he reached for a different response. That small human mercy had opened a fissure in his hardened view of the enemy. Scholars who later studied POW camps noted that generosity occurred not only because of moral clarity but often through the practicalities of manpower and motion. Guards who treated prisoners with dignity sometimes saw better cooperation. Yet these utilitarian explanations do not diminish the moral weight of kindness. There is a difference between feeding a force to preserve productivity and feeding a person because you have recognized them. In that mess hall, both motives might have intertwined, but the aspect that lingers is the recognition of personhood. After the war, a few of the prisoners kept letters and newspaper clippings about that Christmas. They would show them to children and grandchildren like talismans. They would point to a line where a sergeant had written that on that day, he had felt more like a human than a soldier. In memoirs and testimonies, the feast is retold with variations. The pie might be apple in one account, pumpkin in another. The guard's name can change with the memory, but the kernel of truth persists. Kindness happened, and it mattered. There is also a deeper irony to consider. War is supposed to dehumanize. It draws lines where once there were neighborhoods and kitchens. Yet acts like that meal create an unintended stubborn memory that complicates the tidy narratives of victor and vanquished. They remind us that enemies are often people who look like us and who feel like us, that the categories of politics cannot fully consume the totality of a person's life. For modern viewers, the story is not a salve for guilt, nor is it propaganda for any nation. It is an invitation to imagine the landscape of human feeling beneath geopolitical shifts. It asks us, what could simple acts of decency do in our own polarized times? How many fences exist because someone never offered a plate of food? How many hearts stay closed because no one ever said the small, surprising words that constitute recognition? In the archives, the photograph of a long table with men seated becomes almost unbearably intimate, a snapshot that resists being categorized. It compels the observer to lean in and ask the small question, who are these men when not numbers? The answer is messy. It requires memory. Yet the answer persists in those who kept the story, in the letters that survived, in the small spirals of orange peel brown in a soldier's trunk. The legacy of such moments is also generational. The children of the men who remembered learned that even amid ruin there are choices. Those choices were often anonymous, like a cook deciding to put extra butter on potatoes, like a sergeant arguing for a holiday. From anecdote, these small acts aggregate into a different ethic, one that allows for empathy even when the political structure demands enmity. That ethic sometimes becomes civic, in later programs for reconciliation and veterans exchanges, and sometimes remains personal, a private memory that informs how one loves and treats one's neighbor. The final, quiet point is this: small human mercies do not end wars. They do not repair cities nor undo the catalog of violence, but they alter the interior landscape of those who receive and those who give. They keep in the fragile ledger of memory evidence that humanity persisted even in the worst of seasons. And when nations later write treaties and histories, these personal records complicate the story in a useful and necessary way. They remind us that the past is not only geopolitics, it is also a mosaic of private acts. On that cold morning when a man in an apron said, "You're our guest today," the world did not instantly become kind. Cities still burned and the war lasted its appointed time. But behind a wooden mess hall for a few small hours, the map of enmity blurred. A plate, a pie, an orange peel. These small things worked like an incision in the hardened heart of war. Sometimes the simplest words, "It's Christmas," are the ones that crack the world open and let light in. If this story stayed with you, hold it like a small light. A frontline brings you the human moments the textbooks often miss, the ones that tell us who we are when the machinery of war pauses for a moment. Subscribe for more stories that reveal the surprising, tender edges of history. Tell us below, which small kindness in your life has changed you? Share your memory, and let us remember together.